I wanted to, on behalf of the Council, thank everyone for coming this evening. I think that this is going to be a fascinating discussion. Our guests this evening are Gushran Das and Raja Mohan. I'm not going to go through their resumes. They're available for you to read, and you probably already know them. And I thought I'd begin, since the topic of this evening is will India become a world power? Will India establish global primacy? To introduce, just at the start, an alternative point of view from someone who's also spoken at the Council. Our guests know that I'm going to do this, from Jim Rogers, who's one of the country's most successful investors and the author of Biker Capitalist some time ago. And just so that we're all aware there's an other side to this issue, Jim said a couple of months ago that it's best to stay clear of India. As an investment destination, India is a sham, he said at a hedge fund conference recently. It's a bit of a mess as far as being a country, and it's the single worst bureaucracy in the world. So we all thought it would be better to have it would be good to have an alternative here. Let me just say a word about both of our guests. Gushran has had an extraordinary and eclectic career, 30 years as a successful businessman, and then, in quotes, retirement, to become an even more successful author. For those of you who've not read India Unbound, I'd recommend it to you. And he has an article in this edition, the summer's edition of Foreign Affairs, which you all probably picked up at the table. Raja Mohan is one of India's foremost national security and foreign policy thinkers. He also has an article in this summer's edition, and he's recently written, among his several books, he's recently come out with a book called The Impossible Alliance: India, the United States, and Nuclear Proliferation, and global order. Let me say in a hurry that while the issues that are discussed in both of these articles are going to be will inevitably be some of the material and the substance of this discussion this evening, the topic of this discussion is not those two articles. They sort of form some of the context. The context really is kind of what next. That some of that context is obvious, and I'll state kind of four obvious points. Is the striking improvement in India's economy over the last 10 years, the difference between India's development path and those of others, most notably another country of more than 1 billion people in Asia, the emergence of the evolution of a de facto U.S.-India strategic alliance, what that might mean and where that might go, and India's clear interest in playing a global role in the future. But I think there are two more fundamental points to that. Is that if it's a reasonable question to ask, will India become a global power, it's a strikingly new kind of question. And it's one that the established world has had difficulty in the past. If you think about the beginning of the 20th century, when there were two rising powers, Germany and Japan, we didn't deal with those rises and those changes in the global order particularly well. And while the results of the rise of India and, parenthetically, the rise of Japan would hopefully not lead to a century like the last one, it's nevertheless the case that that these fundamentally upset and changed the established order. There's a second piece of context, which is that India's path of development has been quite different and quite distinctive from those of most other emerging economies and developing nations. And it leads to a different sense, I think, of implication. I thought in Gushran's book, India Unbound, that there was more to the word unbound than simply the notion of an economy that would grow rapidly. Why don't I start with a question to both of you, which is what do you take in the meaning of the title of this evening's discussion? Will India become a global power? What's that mean? How do we know when we're there? And what's the time frame? Gushran, why don't I start with you and then go to Raja?
Well, frankly, I have not spent too much time thinking about India as a global power. I'm sure Raja is much better qualified to talk about it. I've been concerned about questions of society, economy, our culture, and where we are going. And certainly the central idea of India Unbound was the idea that the old centralized bureaucratic state is now finally in decline and has been in decline for at least 15 years or more. And while the West has just discovered India in a sense, the story of India's growth is a 25-year-old story. I mean, India has been growing at 6% from 1980 to 2002 and at 7.8% from 2002 to 2005. So it's a 25-year-old story. The basic thing, what's happening at the same time, is the fact that the population has begun to slow down, and you know, from a sort of a historic 2.2% growth rate after independence, it was down to about 1.7, and now most demographers project 1.5. And our base rate of growth, economic growth, is now 7. So 7 minus 1.5, which is the population, gives you a per capita income growth of 5.5. Now that is really what Korea grew at for 30 years. And that's sort of where India is at today. So, I mean, I see the economic rise of India as an inevitable fact. It's not dependent on any state or any government. Obviously, if you have reforming governments, it will happen faster. But that's why I say in my article that India is rising despite the state. And because it's a people's success, it's a success, organic success from below, therefore it is more likely to endure. And it's unlike China, which is dependent. China is a state-induced success, and India is a success despite the state.
I think on the question of the relationship between economic capability and great power status, now we've known from the history of the United States itself that the US became the #1 economy at the turn of the 20th century. But after that, it was a struggle for 40 years within the US of some wanting to play a much larger role, others saying, no, we should not. Therefore, it's not automatic that once you have strong economic capabilities, you inevitably become a great power. So there have to be forcing events. It is the nature of the domestic debate that follows. And in fact, we had the British intelligence had to run a whole operation here in New York to force the Americans to draw them into the Second World War. So the lag between capability and actual exercise of power, I think it's a natural one. So I don't think we need to worry about time frames when exactly, which is the point when India crashes into the bar and says, look, I'm here as a great power. I don't think you're going to get that moment, I mean, of India, opening the doors of the salon and say, look, here we are. It's already happening in spite of India being, relatively per capita terms such a low income. What India and China do in relation to energy policy affects the world outcomes. So I think that is the significant thing that has happened, that what India does, whether in relation to how it organizes itself at home, the kind of policies it would adopt to balance of power, automatically will have influence on the outcomes. So I think what has changed in India is no longer merely a subject of a system of international affairs. What India does today, what India thinks today, can have difference on the actual outcomes. And I think that is the surest sign of the rise of a new power.
I can follow up that, and then I'd want to follow up with your point about the rise despite government. In the 80s and 90s, when I was in the U.S. government at one of those periods, one of the complaints from Indians was always that India tended to be defined in terms of external issues, so that India was defined by the Pakistan issue, or India was defined by a nuclear proliferation issue, or India was defined by its perceived antipathy to alliances. Presumably one of the things that you're saying is that there'll be a lot more self-defining.
Absolutely, but I think one of the things I tried to do in this essay in Foreign Affairs was to write about Indian foreign policy without reference to either Pakistan or non-alignment. It's quite an achievement.
You almost succeeded.
Yeah, almost succeeded. So, I think the shift I think that is taking place in India is that for years, given the significance of partition and its consequences, I would say the India-Pakistan problem is really a reflection of what happened in 1947. And then India's own policies, economic policies, which actually prevented India from realizing a full economic potential. Once the economic direction changed, there was the automatic consequence that a large country like India begins to integrate with the world. It didn't take more than 10 years for the effects to be felt. Second, I think the Indian discourse itself and the outside world was so focused on non-alignment. If you step back from last 60 years, and it is possible to interpret India's actions in the last 60 years purely in terms of power, its relationship with the Soviet Union, its pretense of the leadership of the Third World, you name it, that there was a power dynamic to it, and that it is possible to interpret India's own non-alignment actually as a balance of power between the two blocs. So I think the change that is taking place in India today is it can historicize its own experience. It can look at itself and its outcomes in terms of power and not the moral politic which we people are so fond of fooling ourselves and fooling the rest of the world. I think we're moving away from that to one of seeing India in terms of power. And let me just conclude with one thought, that many of the ideas of India's foreign policy actually go back to British India. That these are not, that if you remove the non-alignment, that phase of our rhetorical non-alignment, but you step back and say, Nehru continued much of Curzon's policies when you talk about India's neighborhood. If you ask our ambassador like Neelam Devi sitting how we deal with our neighbors, she'll tell you very little change from the British conception of the nature of India's policy, which is determined by geography. So I would say geography, power, those enduring elements of India's foreign policy, it's possible to see them more clearly today, once we step back from the self-deluding rhetoric about India being a moral politic, nation of moral politic.
Gusharan, if you, both in your other writings and in this edition of Foreign Affairs writings, suggest quite a trick for government. You make the point that anyone who has ever invested in India or dealt with the Indian economy would agree with completely, which is that India's rise is almost despite the government and the bureaucracy rather than because of it. And you comment on how difficult it has been for India to pursue consistently a policy of the retreat of the government from the economy. But at the same time, implicit and explicit in your writings are two advances of government. One is in the provision of public services, and the other is, one might say, in governance, I guess, in the transparency of governance, the provision of the right context for markets, for industries and business. Can India make that model change?
Well, I think it's a bit simplistic, actually, to think that any nation can do without the government. You need the government. You need the government at least to be the umpire And you need, and you know, despite my being such a critic of the Indian government, I think they're real achievements that we should recognize. Certainly, the non-economic achievements are obvious. Democracy, keeping the country, the most diverse, the most infuriatingly diverse country in the world together, is a great achievement of the state. So democracy and the things that, and also in more recent times, some of the regulatory regulators we've put in place, the telecom regulator, why we've had a telecom revolution, which is completely mirroring the Chinese revolution, is because of a good regulator. But having said that, I think the problem is that where you need government, it's asleep, and it's hyperactive still where you don't need it meddling around. And where it's asleep is in the provisioning of the basic services that in the West you take for granted. Good primary schools, primary hospitals where people can go. And in my piece, I provided some data showing how 1 out of 4 school teachers doesn't show up in a government primary school, and you can do nothing about it, because the union of teachers is so strong, plus the fact that teachers are the invigilators at elections, and so politicians are scared of teachers. And the elections take place in schools, generally. The same thing for doctors. 2 out of 5 doctors in a primary health center do not show up when they should. So these kinds of things, and the state of course believes that only it can provide it. It cannot conceive of the thought that, okay, we can provide the money, but other people can provide it. But against this depressing statistic, you have to see the happy side, that the demand for education is so great that what's happening, that even the poor are pulling their kids out of government schools and putting them into private schools which cost $1 to $3 a month. And those schools which cost $1 to $3 a month deliver a better quality of education. The teacher shows up. They even try to teach some kind of English there. They're not very good schools, but the fact is, and this is what I mean, I think the success of India is the success of its people. And the people are able to rise on their own and create these institutions, private. You know that spending on healthcare, now US is supposed to be the most private sector healthcare country in the world. But India has doubled the rate, doubled the ratio of spending as a percent of GDP than the US on healthcare, which is private. That is, percent of private spending on healthcare is double than even the most sort of free market system. So what I think the story really is, that people just don't sit around and complain. They get up there, they pull their socks up on it, or their shoelaces or whatever it is, and lift themselves up. And why India matters, and why you talk about power, is, I think, the Indian middle class, which is much reviled by all the leftists and all in India. But it is really the class that's the fastest growing class in the world. And this class has quadrupled since it's now about 250 million, 25%. But by 2020, it will be more than 50% of the population. And then, of course, with 50% of the population and democracy, then perhaps governance will also change. And the other fact, of course, is the English language. India already, according to some pundits.
I'm going to get to the English language. Let me ask each of you a quite different question, and I'm going to conclude with a question about the English language with you. We had a fascinating discussion on that. I'd like to ask both of you about China. I'm interested, from your perspective, of the nature of the relationships as both countries become or aspire to global power within Asia over, let's say, the next decade.
I think I would say between India and China, these are the best of the times, and these are also the worst of the times. Our relationship at the level of politics and economics has never been as good. It's a matter of time. In 2 years, China will be our largest trading partner. For the first time, we're talking seriously about the boundary dispute that has been there for 60 years. There's lot more exchange between the politicians, between people, full spectrum of exchange that is taking place between the two countries. Yet, you're beginning to see the emergence of a significant competition between the two, both for influence as well as for greater say in how the regions that they abut have to be managed. So therefore, it is both the elements of expanding engagement between ourselves as well as competition for influence in the rest of Asia. Now, you know Burma, which Ambassador Dave dealt with it. I mean, I think there's not a day that passes when, in fact, our Foreign Secretary is right now there. If China builds a road, we're going to build another 2. If China gets a contract for a port, we hopefully will get another one. That it is a relentless competition. Let me say this, a lot of Americans feel somehow, it's all about China. And India is not going to wait, has never waited for American permission to balance China. We don't need American permission, American support, or American endorsement, because from 1950, ever since we hit the world at the same time, 47, 40, and then 1949, that the competition for influence, or being two different models that existed. That, I don't think you can take it away. The challenge, I think, for us in the coming years is really, can India and China prevent this competition from turning into rivalry? Now, there are 2 views on that. One, which is there is a classic security dilemma, 2 rising powers, neighbors, both have outsized egos and outsized ambitions, so they're bound to clash. The other, of course, which says there is a prospect of cooperative security, that there is so much in the world today of globalization that you need to cooperate. My sense is we're going to see both elements. And which one would prevail would depend upon how internal change in China will take place. Well, let me just conclude with this thought that India is not going to play second fiddle to the Chinese. And so we're not going to become a clapper boy behind the Chinese and saying, we are against the United States, or we want a multipolar world. We also want a multipolar world, but we also want a multipolar Asia. We don't want just limit China to take over Asia. We're not going to accept it, whichever side the Americans might be on, because we've been with the Chinese for the last 20 years. So we're not going to accept that situation. We will, on our own steam, try and balance the Chinese. But at the same time, we want to avoid that as long as possible and try to expand our own cooperation with China.
You've had some absolutely fascinating points of view about the difference between the Indian and the Chinese model. You were going to interject.
Well, the way I think about India and China is really that India has law and China has order. And that really, in a way, defines the 2 countries. And what is the chaotic democracy of India? See, democracy came before capitalism in India, and capitalism came before democracy, or if maybe we don't know, but hopefully, capitalism before democracy in the case of China. Now, I think these really differentiate these 2 countries. But I think at heart, because I'm in touch with people who are in the business world, what the big difference is that while China is making these huge strides in exports, manufactured exports. These exports are produced either by foreign companies or by state-owned enterprises. Very small part is really the entrepreneurial success. And that's why a Chinese businessman was telling me that, you know, you guys, you have 100 companies over $1 billion in India. And he was talking about the entrepreneurial success again. As a private equity guy, you'd sympathize with this. In India, we have, I think today, about 20 to 25 companies which are either globally competitive or are on the verge of being so. And China maybe has 3, 4, 5. And this is why a professor in Beijing University sent me an email and he was saying, you know, we would die for that kind of thing. And so this goes back to my earlier point that India's success is a success of the private individual. And that private individual has had to fight not only the competitor in the market, but has also had to fight his own government. So he's a hardier soul.
It's like the...
You know? And I think that's... and the other part, of course, is our histories. China has had perhaps one of the most violent histories of the 20th century. And India's was spoiled by amazing peace. We skipped the 2 world wars, practically. And in fact, we were a nation created by saints in the shadows of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And so I think that India could only be a democracy. It cannot be anything else. That was it. I mean, people, this is one of the questions, the conundrum of our times, is how this nation really got democracy. And very few people can explain it. But I think it's that what we were talking earlier, what you were talking about, that it's the temper of the people. We are basically a anarchic, individualistic people who cannot be, each of the 600,000 Indian villages thinks it's still a self-governing republic. And the Brahmin in the temple of these villages thinks he's the Pope. So that's the temper. That's the temper of the people. And I think that's perhaps what explains a lot about India.
I know that I, in very soon, have to turn to the audience, but there are 2 questions I've been dying to ask. One is to ask you to expand on a line that is in the article. This discussion is not about the article, but I was dying to have a discussion about it, where in discussing the potentialities of a U.S. and India alliance, you say that it's really more dependent upon the U.S. developing a hitherto undemonstrated capacity for equal alliances, equal partnerships.
No, I think the Americans are used to either they lead or they get out of the way. I mean, there's no other option. And I think the U.S. has been so strong for so long that the idea of sharing leadership or sharing responsibilities with anyone, it does not arise. And given the way the U.S. towered over Europe at the end of the Second World War and East Asia, that it was a natural thing for the U.S. to do that kind of thing. But the problem, India is, of course, is not going to be a camp follower. India is not going to accept a subsidiary junior partner status to anybody, because India is too large that to be able to fit into anybody's pocket. So how do you structure that alliance then between India and the US? That is, one is both countries are used to playing solo. Each one thinks too much of themselves, and therefore, how do you structure this relationship? And I think that is going to be our main challenge. It is not that the interests of the 2 countries don't converge today. They do converge, whether it is on question of promoting democracy, the question of dealing with the energy issues, whether it is the whole range of stability-related issues in Indian Ocean Asia. But how do we work together? I think that's where the problem is. And I think there, I would say, the US, the luxury for the US post-1991, that its centrality, its unipolar status is going to help solve problems. Hopefully the debate here is shifted to saying, look, the US, how powerful it is, because US is going to be the #1 power for the foreseeable future. But if it wants to deal with problems, it needs to share responsibilities with other powers. And I would say India is never going to be a Britain to the United States, nor a Japan to the United States. I mean, India is not a defeated nation. It's not that the US came and rescued us from our collapsing situation. As India rises, I think it's necessary for the US to see India as a partner. And US itself, I think, in the coming years needs strong partners, not yes men all around the world.
That's a point we'll come back to. You made a fascinating point about English when we were talking earlier, and it goes, I think, to the heart of everyone says that India is the largest English-speaking nation in the world now, but what's that actually mean? And the point you made was that at the end of the 19th century, the language of power was British English, and at the end of the 20th century, it was American English. And at the end of the 21st century, it'll be English. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, English became an Indian language in the 1990s, when the minds of the young people finally became decolonized. And David Crystal, who is the author of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the English Language, he says India already has the largest number of English speakers. I feel that's a bit optimistic. I feel probably but certainly it will be by 2010 or 2015. India will have the largest number of English speakers. How you define with what kind of comfort does a person operate? The fact of the matter is that a German can get a good job without knowing English, and a Chinese can get a good job without knowing English, but an Indian has to know English. So the driving force is very great in India for learning, and therefore it's spreading very rapidly. And any of you who are entrepreneurs, that is the single biggest opportunity for making a cool $1 billion. It was David Crystal who said that the language of the world at the end of the 19th century was British English, and the 20th century was American English, and he predicts that it will be Indian English at the end of the 21st century. Now, I think the dynamics, certainly the numbers, are going in a way that if, and with the media expanding and the global media coming, if 400 million Indians speak a word in a certain way, that will be the way the word will be spoken around the world. For this whole thing, for Indian English to become a reality, I think we will have to produce a Shakespeare of Indian English. And what will the things that will help, I think, in the process will be, Salman Rushdie played an important role, because Salman Rushdie allowed Indians to write in a way that was different. And just as Mark Twain did for you Americans, he liberated the American to write in a certain way. But Salman Rushdie is not Shakespeare. And I think that it is very important to produce, and I think India will produce a lot more writers. Already India is producing writers in English, and this will continue. But, you know, being a noisy democracy, there are a lot of people who are pulling the other way. The linguistic chauvinists of the different languages, naturally. And what they, instead of concentrating on making their own languages successful, they're still trying to pull English down, but they're trying to push water up the hill. The market's just too powerful for them to have an effect. But still, I mean, like I was telling you, in Bangalore, in the city of Bangalore, which you associate with New India, in this city, it is in this state of Karnataka, where Bangalore is the capital, it is illegal to teach English from grade 1 to grade 5. And so how do schools and parents cope with this? They cope with it by having classes called physical education, knitting, where they teach English as a subterfuge. And of course the irony is that the Minister of Education of Karnataka went to China, and the government in China asked him, would you teach our children English, our primary children school English? And he was not honest enough to admit that he was not allowed to do that in his own. Anyway, that's just an aside. I think these are the reality of the democracy, when funny things like these keep happening. I think the future language of India is a very interesting question, and I have called it in an article I wrote, is that it's English. English with an I. English with an I, because there are different parts of India, and there's Bengali, which has a lot of Bengali words into English, so it's a kind of, they call it Binglish, and Punjabi, which has Pinglish, and Tamil, which is Tinglish. And so we have all these Englishes all over. But what is uniting them together is media. Very strongly. You cannot be a copywriter today unless you combine some English words with Indian language words for success. Essentially, I think the linguistic chauvinists are you know, their case is they're not going to prevail. Indians every Indian knows 2-3 languages very easily, and they're very comfortable. But English, I think, will be the language of India. And there's something.
I'd like to turn it to you all now. Let me state the rules. That wait for the mic, ask a question, don't give a speech, give your name and affiliation, and while you're thinking about it, we also have a number of people in this discussion as part of a teleconference, and one of them asked the following question, which I think, Gushran, is probably more directed to you, but I think you should respond also, is that in considering whether India will become a global power, two seemingly contradictory images of India are juxtaposed. On the one hand, India is a third world country with potable water unavailable to much of the population, exceedingly poor transportation, disease and poverty on a massive scale. And on the other hand, India is a model of development based on a highly educated population, the IT boom, nuclear weapons, and high-tech medicine. Can India become a global power if it does not reconcile these two aspects of its national identity?
I think that this is how all countries have actually developed. Maybe in the case of India, it's more polarized, that you have a very highly educated population which is comfortable in business class lounges around the world. But in fact, you've always had in every society parts of societies which move faster than others, and slowly, I mean, the American South was so poor before Second World War. You couldn't get a job. And then it was only the invention of air conditioning in the Second World War which made Atlanta, Dallas, Houston come up as places where you could actually go and work. So I think we have our Bihars, we have our Orissas, and eventually they'll be 20 years behind, but they'll catch up.
I would say, I think the point that Das is making is that, look, capitalism always develops in an uneven manner. That there's been never a country where everything is done in a neat, that's called socialism, when you try to do everything in a neat way, and now even the Chinese have given that up. And when Deng Xiaoping said, some people should get rich first, I think that was a brilliant formulation. We said the coastal regions will get rich first, now then we'll extend it to the interior. And that's how now you see the Chinese moving huge amounts of investment into the so-called Go West policy. And why go to the south? What about the Appalachians in this very state of New York? So even when you have such a developed state like New York, I mean, you had large parts of it were poor, were underdeveloped. Southern states, even on politics, were one-party states. It is only until the 70s no Republican could show face or to contest a local election. So I think these things never come in neat packages. They always come in complex dynamics. And in the case of India and China especially, given their size, the Chinese and Indians have to be only $2,000 per capita. That dramatically changes the world. You don't have to get $20,000 per capita of the type of the East Europeans or someday might get, or the Americans have. So I think you've got to treat this very differently. I think as we grow into a power, some of these problems themselves will be addressed, because in a democracy, I think the pressure of votes, of getting people to line up and vote, that itself is going to act as an incentive to move things.
I think the big difference also is here between India and China. In India, we have free migration. In fact, the big story of India is the internal migration. The Indian Railways sells 4.5 billion tickets a year, and India has 1 billion people. So the average Indian takes four journeys on the railways, and often there for work. They go from Bihar to Bombay, etc. And I think that's our safety valve, in a sense. And therefore, we shouldn't be too obsessed, I think, at this stage with inequality. The important thing is that 1% of India has been crossing the poverty line every year for the last 25 years. And that, when it adds up, I mean, 200 million Indians have crossed the poverty line in 25 years.
Let me turn it to you all. Yes, ma'am. Wait just a second.
Lynn Nesbitt, Janklow and Nesbitt. Gurcharan, you said that in 2020, that more than 50% of the Indians will be middle class. Either one of you, how does that relate to China and the middle class?
Well, I certainly can speak a lot more comfortably about India on this score than China, but, first of all, our middle class, the way we define it, is not a car-owning middle class. It's a scooter-owning middle class. But the values of the middle class are the same. That is, it's a middle class that invests in the future, in the education of its children, pulls itself up by its bootstraps. That's the kind of middle class I was talking about. And, China is ahead. But as far as middle class numbers, etc., Lynn, I don't really know. Maybe, Raja, you can throw some light on that.
In fact, I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago. We were debating what India and China can learn from each other. The Indian participants were saying we should learn from China, and the Chinese were saying no, they had to learn from India. So I think you show the Indian middle class today is acutely conscious of what it does not have, of infrastructure, more purposeful state. While the Chinese middle class, I think, is beginning to see what they don't have. That is, some element of democracy, some way of participatory government, and some way of even talking about corruption openly. So I think it's not the numbers that matter, but once you cross a threshold, how this class is going to react against their seeming oppressors in both the states, in different forms, that will be more interesting, I think, to watch.
Jacob Frankel, AIG. This was indeed a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. I'd like to make a couple of observations related to the China-India.
Short observation.
Very short, but I would like to get some view. As one looks at the world in 2020, demographers tell us that the size of the population of India and China will be larger than what it is now by close to 500 million people, where India will surpass China. But India has a dream of a demographic map, whereas China has a very severe aging population. Now, I wonder if you would agree with this and the implication. Second point is about the growth strategy, whereas China has a very clear export strategy for growth, India has less so. And there is an observation that says that as a result, China's growth has created much more antagonism from the rest of the world because of its export domination, and as a result may be actually disturbed through protectionist pressures and the like, whereas India may sail much more smoothly.
I think let me take the second part first. And the fact of the matter is that India has kind of stumbled into a model which is really not at all planned. I mean, it's really quite scary in a way, because India is not following the classic Asian model of growth, which was based on low-cost manufactures of toys and shoes and, low-tech items. It is a much more domestic-led growth. So it's not an export-led growth. It's a consumption-led model. India's consumption rate is 64% of GDP versus China, 42% of GDP. It is a services-led growth rather than manufacturing-led growth. And you'd think services come after manufacturing, but here services have preceded manufacturing. And finally, even in manufacturing, it is high-tech manufacturing, which is not labor-intensive, versus China's much more labor-intensive manufacturing model. So the Indian model is a unique model. And the scary part about it is that the question remains about how are we going to create those jobs for the millions on the farms who we have to get out of the farms. And there is not an easy answer to that question. To your second point about population, the fact, you're absolutely right, that today India's labor is about 400 million people are working. China, 800 million people are working. This is because of the demographics of the two countries. But in 2025, it will be the opposite. There will be 800 million working people in India versus 400 million working people, which is the aging problem and the demographic dividend that we talk about vis-a-vis India. And when you have a growth rate now of 7%, you can actually absorb. At 3.5%, we couldn't absorb people into the labor market. But at 7% and hopefully going to 8%, you can absorb the people. So really, it's a situation where India, because half the population of India is below the age of 25, it is demographically better placed than China is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
I'm Bruce Scherer from the Synagros Institute. This question is for Mr. Mohan. Mr. Mohan, do you believe that human progress essentially depends on justice and human rights and democracy and pluralism? And if so, why shouldn't India be a moral democracy rather than jockeying for realpolitik, power, position, and standing?
Yeah. It's a good question. The tension, I think, for all democracies, from the beginning, I mean, I think you have, do you work for order or you do work for justice? I mean, that's one central tension. In the foreign policies, whether the US has faced this dilemma again and again, that today the idea that the US, when Bush administration talks about promoting democracy, it's attacked both from the left and the right, saying, look, you're crazy, you're out of your mind. Work for stability in the Middle East. Why are you talking about democracy in the Middle East? So, but at the same time, you have people on the left, on the liberal side, who always argued promotion of democracy is an important thing. And I think the challenge for any democratic state in conducting its foreign policy is that how do you balance both these imperatives? That if you stand for certain values, do you export them and do you insist on giving it to others? Or do you believe that, look, in international politics, where there's no state is still the sovereign body within itself, there is no international civil society, there is no supranational ordering mechanism within international politics. Therefore, the compromise between order and justice is a permanent one, and that all states, whatever we might say publicly, whatever the presidents and prime ministers might say, you're constantly troubled to make that compromise. Like today, India, we talk about promoting democracy in Nepal, but we're happy to deal with the military regime in Burma because the Chinese are moving into northern Burma. We can't let the Chinese take over northern Burma, period. It's a straightforward assertion of the question of Chinese power. Do I accept Chinese power in northern Burma? Similarly for US, it talks about democracy in Iraq. For Saudi Arabia, okay, let's give it a little more time. So I would say the US tells us, be nice to General Musharraf. He's a nice guy. We can actually, you engage him, maybe there will be democracy 5 years down the road. But they tell us, Burmese, why are you doing with the Burmese? We're going to pass sanctions on the Burmese. Both are generals. But actually, one general doesn't use terrorism against us. He's actually helping us fight terrorism. The other guy continues to use. So our judgment is, we're actually ended up engaging both the generals. So I think the choice is, it is not a morality play. I think how much the illusion that liberals in the West have created post-1991, that the problem of power challenge has been eliminated. Therefore, it is only a question of ordering institutions and rules and getting to do that. And I think what the world we've seen in the last few years, we don't have that luxury, and that the compromise between order and justice will remain a central element, even for the most consistent democracies in the world.
Yes.
My question is to Mr.
Wait a minute, just one second.
Hi, my name is Julia Wei. If I understand you correctly, Mr. Das, when you were talking about the industrialization and your economic growth in the past few years, it's not giving any credit to the government because the industry, they're pulling their shoelaces by themselves. Isn't that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh did the economic reform in 1991-92, and now he's really keen on improving the economic situation, put a lot of investment into infrastructure. Could you elaborate a little bit? Can he bring the Indian government out of the shadow of huge bureaucracy of 10 million people and improve the corruption situation?
Well, I wish I could be optimistic about that. The fact of the matter is that here is a Prime Minister who really was instrumental, played a very important role in 1991 and really deserves a lot of credit and deserves credit for pushing the government out of the way. That's what really the reforms. That's another definition of reform. There are many ways you can define it as creating competition and all, but very largely it has meant that state monopolies have been broken and the bureaucracies has had to step out, pushed out of the way. It is disappointing for us, frankly. 2 years have gone by, and this government has done probably the least amount of reform. There's a dream team, 3 people, all who were associated with the 1991 reforms, and it has the worst record. The nice thing is that every government has done some reform after 1991. And therefore, those reforms have added up, even slow reforms. And for various reasons, this government actually has gone, it hasn't gone backwards because it hasn't undone reforms, but the attitudes it has brought, and perhaps under a very strong leftist pressure of the left, it has had to do it. And I understand that. I mean, a lot of people are willing to appreciate the fact that the historic role of the left is to make us realize they are poor people, and it's make us realize, to humanize capitalism. But frankly, we have so far the pendulum still to go that, you know, at this, we can't start humanizing. You can't start sort of distributing the pie before it's baked. And that's what we were doing for 40 years. We were redistributing poverty. And so all the ideas of this government are about redistributing poverty once again. So it's a great sense of personal disappointment, I feel. Because I'll tell you, I was in New York just after he became Prime Minister. The market had crashed. Stock market had crashed because the leftists had made some statements. And on Wall Street, a number of people had asked this question to me. Well, what do you think? And I said, look, you're in safe hands. Manmohan Singh, Chidambaram, Montek Singh. My God, what better team could you have? But this team has let us down.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Bal Gopal Das, INSCAP Partners. This is a question for Mr. Mohan here. I'd like for you to share some of your thoughts on the issue of rise of Islam, fundamentalist Islam, and the rise of India. How do you see the two interacting over the course of the next several years? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. Firstly, we must be clear that India is an Islamic nation, that we have 150 million Muslims, and that the subcontinent has actually, if you put India, Pakistan, Bangladesh together, 40% of the world's Muslims live in the subcontinent. Given the, of course, New York's obsession with the Middle East, you might think there is a, you know, most of the Muslims live between Iran and the Atlantic, but actually 40% live between Iran and Bangladesh, and then another 20% in Indonesia. So the struggle against Islam, I mean, the question today, whether it's the war on terror, whatever you want to call it, or the struggle for modernizing Islam or Islamizing modernity, whatever you pose the problem, I think the success of that struggle is going to be in South Asia, not in the Middle East. However much the delusions of the debate here might take it. That the origins of quite a bit of political Islam were in the subcontinent. And the partition of the subcontinent was the first success of political Islam in the history of political Islam. My sense is that if India can reconcile with Pakistan and Bangladesh, if India can overcome the consequences of partition that took place in 47, if India, Pakistan, Bangladesh can structure a different framework for regional cooperation and coexistence, I think we've taken one big leap against radical Islam. And I think that is the challenge, and I think there, for the first time, the Americans don't have to intervene either for Pakistan against India, for India against Pakistan. That if US joins India in constructing a cooperative framework in South Asia, and in reintegrating what was actually a single economic space. The subcontinent was a single market till 1947. So we don't have to, we're not doing like Europe. We're not integrating, we're reintegrating. We're removing the barriers that exist today. Once we do that, and I think then the fact that 40% of the world's Muslims can live with a large community of other religions in the subcontinent, that message itself would be a big demonstration effect and a powerful a lesson for the rest of the world in terms of how we deal with radical Islam.
Thanks. Whenever you do this, the sternest adjuration that you're given is to end at 7:30. I want to thank our guests for what are extremely perceptive and interesting remarks, and thank you all for this.